Hello my disciples, Father Andrew here. Welcome to my 7th episode of Character Cross Section. Today we'll be talking about Dr. Mathew Cross, known as the Red Man from the Forest. Also, sorry if you can hear my mouse clicking, I'm going to try and edit that out as best as I can. But anyway, Dr. Mathew Cross, also known as Matt and the Red Man or the Red Cannibal, is the primary, although mostly unseen, antagonist of the Forest. First encountered at the plane crash at the beginning of the story, in which he kidnaps the player's son Timmy. But in regards to the actual lore surrounding Mathew Cross as a character, it's overall pretty patchy and is expressed entirely through a combination of story items and environmental details. So what I'm going to do is grab all the lore evidence, put it all up on screen, and in no particular order I'm going to go through it and explain each one. And while all this evidence could be used to make several theoretical timelines, I'm going to be assembling one I think makes the most sense. And with that explanation of the plan out of the way, now to get into the aforementioned evidence. Firstly, he can be encountered at various points on the map if they're approached correctly, which shows he is alive prior to us heading to the Saharah facility. Secondly, he has noticeably defined muscles in a similar way to the cannibal natives of the island, which is possibly due to the artifact's effects on his body. Thirdly, he clearly cares about his daughter Megan Cross, evident by him taking her to Saharah for medical treatment, going through the efforts to revive her, and the Megan Cross shrine you can find in the Saharah labs. Fourthly, according to the autopsy papers you can find, Megan Cross and Jessica Cross both apparently died around September 20th, the autopsy being on September 25th, rigor mortis having already set in during the autopsy, which I'm just going to explain a quick issue with that. Rigor mortis appears approximately 2 hours after death in the muscles of the face and progresses to the limbs over the next few hours, completing between 6 to 8 hours after death. It stays for another 12 hours till 24 hours after death, then disappears. Which means both have to have died somewhere between 8 to 24 hours before the autopsy, which isn't possible considering the 5-day gap between death and autopsy written on the paperwork. But anyway, the notified by implies that Megan died first, the mother notified them about the death, then she was killed shortly after, probably by Mathew Cross and found by her sister. But as to why he probably killed her is something I'll go over later. In addendum to that, the one for Jessica Cross, the ex-wife, can notably be found next to a bucket of red paint, which implies Mathew Cross has something to do with it. Anyway, moving on. Fifthly, it is assumed that he treats Timmy reasonably well even after abducting him, even as he plans to kill the boy, and this is based on one of the drawings we can find. Sixthly, the cannibals deeply fear and or worship Dr. Cross. The red figure drawn in the cave and his red paint is him possibly exploiting that for his own protection. Him pretending to be some sort of divine figure so that the cannibals won't interfere with him. Seventhly, he possibly had something to do with the beheaded lawyers in the lawyer cave as a result of losing custody of his daughter. Eighthly, the various Polaroid pictures are likely photographed by him, presumably to help Eric with finding his son, possibly set up after reviving his daughter as to give you the same opportunity he had. Ninthly, he is obviously suffering from delusions and mental unwellness, as he refuses to accept his daughter's death, evident from the Bible passages he's written on or referencing in the notes you can find. On a side note in relation to that, 2 of the notes he's written on are on 2 identical Bible pages, and all 3 pages are seemingly unrelated to what was written on them. The Jealous God and Don't Be Afraid pages being the 2 identical ones. Also a little bit of extra information on those. His writings about a jealous God is a reference to Exodus 20-5, which comes from the Old Testament, and based on what the page behind it says, it appears that he's written this on a King James version of the Bible, that applying to the other 2 pages as well, them being New Testament King James Bible pages too. But anyway, moving on. And 10thly, we have the camcorder footage, one featuring Megan Cross in a wheelchair in what appears to be the Saharah cafeteria, and another one showing her present at the escape of an Armsy, her dying to the aforementioned Armsy, probably being after the cafeteria one. 11thly, he was fired for misuse of the equipment, which was likely him trying to revive his daughter. 12thly, he was researching into prolonging life in younglings, Mathew himself being a pediatric geneticist. This being evident from the various project's nature and notes scattered around the labs, which show that they were not only trying to prolong life, but were actively trying to remove the monstrous mutations caused by the artifact. Additional research notes around the lab giving us an insight into this process. Said notes being things like where the mutations were occurring in the genetics, what parts of chemical signaling in the body were going wrong, measurements for theoretical medications to prevent the mutations, sticky notes with little bits of information on them, graphs that show some kind of process which is not really legible, and other stuff which I'm going to be completely honest with you, I do not understand as I am not a chemist. And the name of the project, Gyrus, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is likely a reference to Mark 5:21-43, a Bible passage involving the healing of a young girl. And lastly, the 13th thing, A Megan drawing depicting him as a monster implies that he may possibly have been extremely hostile, or at least became so during the divorce with his ex-wife Jessica. The divorce being something we learn about via the threatening email. And in addendum to this, the restraining order dated June 12th, which mentions stalking and harassment, is very likely related to this as well. And there we go. From all of this, we can now form a timeline of sorts, albeit it lacks some information and has quite a bit of logical guesswork going on. The aforementioned timeline being like this. Starting at the beginning, Dr. Mathew Cross worked for Saharah Therapeutics as the head of the Jarius project, which aimed to create longevity medication for younglings with terminal conditions, which was carried out via the Resurrection Obelisk and studying the results. But his daughter, Megan Cross, would go on to develop an illness that is going to eventually kill her. After this, we have a gap of time where the divorce and restraining order happens, Mathew becoming increasingly aggressive and hostile as it continues. Effects from working with the artifact probably boosting his already growing aggression. But as to why this divorce happened, personally I think Mathew and Jessica disagreed on how to deal with Megan's illness. I imagine it went like this: the mom wanted Megan's final days to be peaceful while Mathew refused to lose his daughter, but the wife knew the effects that the treatments he was working with could have on her, so she refused to go with them, which caused a rift in the marriage. The stress from knowing Megan Cross is going to die and his wife's refusal to let him fix it, leading to increasing frustration and eventually things escalating to the divorce and restraining order. But this is just my educated guess based on everything else. Anyway, after that I assume Mathew resorts to kidnapping his own daughter and takes her for treatment at Saharah, which is why we see her at the cafeteria in one of the videos, only for an escaped Armsy to be what kills her later. Immediately after this, the mother is informed by Saharah about her daughter's death, the mom then informing the pathologist, and she's taken for autopsy. Mathew, still under the restraining order and all the stress from that, and now mourning his daughter's death, goes absolutely insane, heads back to Pringle in Canada, and repeatedly stabs his ex-wife to death violently in a fit of rage, her being later found dead the same day by her sister. After killing her, Mathew likely fled back to Saharah, at which point he began to experiment heavily with the Jarius project as to revive his daughter, only to be fired for it. This only adding to his already worsening insanity, which is why we find those 3 Bible pages, the Megan Shrine, and other such things. It's also around this time that Saharah goes to shit, so he paints himself red as to mimic a divine figure in the cannibals' culture, protecting him from them. He may have also killed the lawyers around this time too. And he later causes the plane crash, takes Timmy, carefully guides him to the lab, resting on the way, then kills him to revive Megan, who becomes mutated. Mathew, knowing you will want your son back, then leaves a trail of clues, which is why we can run into him on the island at various points before he returns to the lab, probably being killed by Megan shortly after. Which brings us to the end of the timeline where we find him dead in the Saharah labs. And with this timeline laid out, which is the best I can make with the given evidence, I can now give my best analysis of Mathew Cross as a character, which to be honest is really difficult as we have little to go on. But regardless, getting straight into that, starting at the very beginning during the management of the Jarius project, Mathew, from what we know, seems to have been an overall average person, albeit exceedingly intelligent and morally dubious considering the nature of his work, but not outright evil. The whole point of the Jarius project being, as seen through Orientation Slideshow 2, to increase longevity in younglings, which would likely be used in combating terminal illnesses as per the case of Megan Cross. Albeit the way this was conducted was brutal, sacrifices being made to the obelisk and its use resulting in mutations, which Mathew Cross was actively trying to prevent. Hence why I call this morally dubious, as while the medical knowledge gained from it would be exceedingly good for mankind and for saving lives, there is the question of if it's even worth pursuing. Personally, I'd say it's not worth it, at least with the methods Mathew used. To be honest, I think, despite it still being quite cruel, Mathew should have used animals like chimps instead of humans, as they're very genetically similar to humans, so the experiments would likely yield very similar results. Said results could later be transferred to human trials in a way that mitigates the risk of unwanted mutations. And without a doubt, while it would definitely suck for the chimp, and we would not want to be in its position, that's the point of using a chimp, as to avoid sacrificing human lives while still getting useful information. But anyway, Mathew was like this up until Megan develops her sickness, and upon finding out it's terminal, both parents begin to disagree on what must be done. Jessica, knowing the risks of Mathew's experimental treatments, denies them and just wants Megan to enjoy whatever time she has left, living her last days in peace. While Mathew, being a caring father, absolutely refuses to let his daughter die, especially when he has the means to actually do something about her condition. This division between the parents and their unrelenting opinions on the situation causing arguments and ever-growing tension, which leads to the divorce and restraining order. The aforementioned tension, the stress from knowing she's going to die, and the wife's refusal to let Mathew Cross try to fix her, being what makes Mathew grow to be so hostile as seen in the email. Then after some time, reaching his boiling point, Mathew finally snaps and kidnaps his daughter, taking her to Saharah for treatment himself, but tries to make her stay as comfortable as possible. But as we know, Megan Cross is killed when an Armsy breaks out of containment. After this, the mother is informed about it, Megan is sent off to autopsy, and Mathew is absolutely fucking devastated. Mourning the loss of his daughter, Mathew, now totally overwhelmed emotionally, completely breaks down and loses control, giving into all the emotions flowing through him. Completely blinded by his emotions, blames it all on his ex-wife, and Mathew, still under a restraining order at this time, travels to Pringle, Canada, finds his ex-wife and unleashes all of his pent-up rage on her, stabbing her to death repeatedly in a fit of manic, psychotic rage. Shortly after this, the wife's body is found by the sister. Meanwhile, Mathew flies back to Saharah, still grieving and still going through stage 1 to 3, denial, anger and bargaining. Driven by his emotions, Mathew leans fully into his work, experimenting heavily with the Jarvis project as to revive his daughter, but the company catches on and he's fired, which he takes personally, amplifying his agony to its utmost point. It's also around this point, while he's researching, the 3 Bible pages come into play along with the Megan Cross shrine, Mathew absolutely refusing to accept that she's gone and will do anything to fix the situation. Saharah around this time also experiences an extreme containment breach and goes to shit, mutants quickly overtaking the facility. Quickly thinking, Mathew paints himself red as to imitate a divine figure from the cannibals' culture, protecting him from them, something he would very much know about given his study of them and the mutants. And while he may have killed the lawyers around this time too, it may have been earlier, albeit he may not be connected to them at all. Which, to be honest, if he did, I imagine he probably would have done it in a fit of rage, considering the fact that they're probably the ones responsible for him losing custody of his daughter. Anyway, after this, Mathew, still in denial and motivated to undo what happened, causes the plane crash and takes Timmy. On the way to the Saharah labs, he treats Timmy fairly well, clearly stopping for breaks to let him rest and to let him draw, as Mathew clearly cares about younglings given the nature of what he was trying to create in the first place, the aforementioned longevity medicine. He still does kill Timmy, however, using him to revive Megan, but Mathew, knowing you are a dad like he is, knows how you will feel when you eventually find Timmy. So after reviving Megan, he leaves a trail of Polaroid clues marking where everything you need is, as to give you the same opportunity he had to save his daughter. This being how we can run into him on the island. He then returns to the lab, having finished what he needs to do, only to be killed by his daughter and impaled in the head with various crayons, which is where we find him for the final time. And with that, now to pretty much just summarise him as a character. Mathew Cross starts off as a morally dubious scientist with fairly good intentions, but due to circumstances outside of his control, he down spirals into a grief-driven madness and will do absolutely anything to save the one person he has left and cares about, albeit he still retains his humanity. Which, to be honest, is the best informed interpretation I can get out of him, as we get very little lore and you pretty much have to connect the dots using your imagination. But overall, before I even conclude this video, I need to say 2 things. Firstly, if you or someone you know is going through a loss like Mathew did here, I have some advice for you or them. As the Gospel of the Scarlet Queen says on page 135, Loss, while one's absence creates misery, notice, remember their times of good, when their presence made the light of life brighter. And be joyful, don't weep for they are gone, smile, rejoice because they and such joy happened, that you were blessed with such. Which basically means think of the good times and appreciate the time you had with them instead of focusing on the pain their absence has created. And honestly, I hope that helps someone who's watching this in some way. But anyway, and secondly, this is kinda out of nowhere, but while writing this video script, the further I kept going, the more Mathew Cross kept reminding me of William Afton, which is weirdly fitting as both have a career and research based around younglings, have turned younglings into monsters as part of their research, albeit with Mathew this was unintentional and he tried to actively stop this from happening, high intelligence and scientific skill, a broken family dynamic, and have similar colour-based alternate fan-given names, William being Purple Guy and Mathew Cross being Red Man. But outside of that, personality-wise, both are exceedingly different. Mathew, while morally dubious in his research methods, clearly had good intentions, while William is outright evil. Kind of strange for me to bring William Afton up during this, but I find the similarities rather odd and thought they were worth mentioning. But it gets even stranger when you consider that FNAF 1 came out nearly 3 months after The Forest in 2014. But that's probably just a coincidence. Anyway, I have a Discord link in the description, thanks for watching, comment any criticisms you have, see you around.